This meeting is being recorded.
Hi, good morning. I'm Sam Candy, CEO of Responsible Futures. Welcome to our webinar, Why Nature-Based Solutions Matter, in partnership with our friends at Earthly. Nature-based solutions are founded on the idea that health and well-managed ecosystems provide critical benefits and services to people, such as removing carbon from the atmosphere, securing safe water resources, improving air quality, and increasing food security. Beyond people, nature-based solutions also help tackle the biodiversity crisis in a way that other technical climate solutions can't. In recent years, nature-based solutions have been a focal point of many environmental movements and organisations that wish to offset their emissions that they can't reduce or remove. The appeal to plant trees, protect forests and biodiversity is seen as a simple and effective way to help reduce carbon emissions and restore natural ecosystems. However, this system can be taken advantage of. Some companies fund nature-based solutions, such as planting trees, without any consideration towards removal or reduction of their existing carbon emissions, and this can lead to accusations of greenwashing. So, how do you get it right, and what is the best thing to do? I'd like to thank Earthly, our partners for this webinar. Let's start with an introduction to our panel. Tell us a little bit about the work that you do and what nature-based solutions mean to you. Oliver, let's start with you.
Hi, Sam. Thanks for organising this. So at Earthly, we're helping 500 companies invest into different nature-based projects, and we're specifically focusing on nature-based solutions, for the areas that you mentioned, the carbon benefits, the biodiversity benefits, and also the fact that they often support those communities at the front line of climate change as well. So we really see the sort of the triple kind of benefits there. And one of the big kind of focuses for us that we talk about quite a lot is this funding gap that we have to nature, this $500 billion annual funding gap, and the importance to close that. And so we spend a lot of time at Earthly thinking about how we can accelerate investment towards nature, and we're going to talk a bit more about some of the specific details in the upcoming session. So looking forward to it.
Thank you. Phoebe, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Phoebe Carter. Thank you for inviting me. I'm a chartered environmentalist with a real passion for trying to promote the value of biodiversity. I think it's massively overlooked. And obviously it underpins pretty much every aspect of our lives. So I currently work for Habitat First Group, which is a development company which tries to build with nature rather than against nature. So we use a lot of nature-based solutions within green and blue infrastructure. I'm also a building with nature assessor as well, which is trying to create sort of better places for sort of people, wildlife and the climate. Thank you.
Richard?
Yeah, thanks, Sam, and good morning, everyone. So I'm Richard. I'm a partner in climate change and sustainability at EY in the UK. And one of my main areas of focus is biodiversity. I've led a lot of projects and initiatives in this area in recent years, and I've been closely connected to some of the global initiatives, frameworks that we see coming in this area, such as the TNFD. So that's me in a nutshell.
Thanks. Elizabeth.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Elizabeth. I'm from the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, specifically from the Business and Nature team. And what we're quite interested in doing is working with business leaders to develop nature positive strategies and also making sure that they're honouring their nature commitments. And it sits within the kind of broader work that we do at CISL, which is really interested in convening all the key economic actors, so government, financial institutions and businesses, to generate positive change for the climate or for the planet through climate, nature and people, and making sure that we recognize that that trifecta is very much interconnected. So looking forward to today's discussion and honoured to be among such an illustrious panel. It's lovely.
Good to have you here. And finally, Thomas.
Illustrious panel sounds good. Yeah, I'm Thomas Gent. I essentially do one of these nature-based solutions. I'm a farmer from South Lincolnshire, Cambridgeshire border, We farm around 800, 900 hectares of combinable arable crops, so usual cropping, but we do it in a regenerative way, which means we are actually storing carbon in the soils. And then I work with a company called a greener, who helps me quantify that and produce a carbon certificate that, you know, I can trade.
Thanks. It's good to have you here. If anyone's got any questions, please put them into the Q&A. I have got lots of questions for the panelists, but please put them in there. Let's start with, where should we focus on nature-based solutions and why? Can we start with you, Oliver?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to have a stab. So I think it really depends on the problem or the goal. For example, with wetlands, you know, they're great at managing stormwater and reducing flooding. You know, coastal systems, so mangroves and coral reefs, are great for storm protection and, you know, protecting from wave erosion and supporting fisheries. But I think it's really important to look at like the location, which locations are suited to which ecosystems and interventions. For example, like not planting trees on savanna grasslands, and really making sure that we're supporting the right ecosystems and locations that will survive and thrive over the coming decades. You know, considering we have a certain amount of kind of baked in climate change to contend with, and you know, and focusing on which ecosystems interventions are going to improve resilience as well. So yeah, that's my initial kind of thoughts on that.
Thomas, what about you? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it really comes down to supporting the person more than the solution, if that makes sense. Because, you know, what we're really trying to do is help nature thrive, and we need to not be prescriptive about that. We need to adapt that to the situation or the land or the area that we're, you know, trying to influence. And the local people are the people that know how that land should be and what plants should grow and, you know, how the beach should look and all that kind of thing. So, for example, here, you know, I know what trees I should grow or what hedges are going to actually grow and what practices are going to work on my soil. So I think it's really down to supporting the person who's operating on that land.
Thank you. Richard, I know how important biodiversity is to you. You speak about it all the time and I follow you. What do you think are the biggest threats to biodiversity?
Yeah, and maybe just a quick comment to sort of build on what we heard just now in terms of, you know, the nature-based solutions, and I agree with everything that we heard. And I think it's always my first comment is I think it's always good to sort of you know, sort of like, you know, take a step back, and you know, you know, so often we've overlooked the importance of nature, and we can take a sort of a anthropocentric view, really. You know, what can nature do for us? You know, I think we should remember that of all our, you know, of our economy, of all our prosperity, you know, it's the root for everything. So, you know, that's sort of the first point. You know, due to human activities in particular, right now it's, you know, nature globally is under threat from, you know, many threats: the accelerating climate crisis, habitat loss and fragmentation of habitats, introduction of, you know, invasive species, nutrient pollution, plastic pollution. You know, and we could go on. There are a lot of threats there. You know, and of course, none of these are, unfortunately, they're not acting in isolation. In many cases, nature is sort of is vulnerable to a combination of these threats. Sort of, you know, accelerating global warming, working also with habitat loss, exploitation, nutrient pollution, and so on. So sort of, you know, there's these interconnected threats that's facing nature at the moment.
Thanks for sharing. Phoebe, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I mean, obviously all of those are the major threats, but I think one of the biggest threats that we sort of overlook is our total disconnection to nature. So many people live
Yes,
without
yeah.
seeing nature, without having any recognition, I guess, of the fact that, you know, they turn on the tap and water comes out, but they don't think about where that water's coming from and how short supply that's becoming, where that waste that they're throwing in the bin goes. Everything you become totally disconnected and focused on your lives. If you're not seeing nature and it feels of no value to you, why would you invest in it? And I think that's something that we really need to get people to recognize, that actual value of biodiversity and what nature does for us.
Yeah.
Elizabeth, you in your work, why do you think that it's becoming so important? Why does it matter so much to the planet?
And I think Phoebe and Richard kind of make some interesting points, because it can be very easy for us as a society to think of biodiversity and nature in the abstract. And, you know, you think of tigers, you think of polar bears, you think of the beautiful tones of David Attenborough. And it's very much like on, you know, a television set, and it feels very removed. And it's very difficult for us as a society to really ground ourselves in the fact that biodiversity is the multitude of living things that make up the planet. So 8 million species, you know, plants, animals, flora, fauna, and the ecosystems that house that. And so I think we forget that very much we rely on biodiversity to provide us with the food that we eat and the clean air that we breathe. But there's also very serious economic context and risk that biodiversity loss poses to us. And so human society and economic activity rely on biodiversity in fundamental ways. There's been research done by the World Economic Forum that shows that $44 trillion of economic value generation, which is about half of the world's GDP, is moderately or highly dependent on nature and its services. And so when we see the damage that we're doing to biodiversity, we don't quite internalize the risk that poses to a functioning economy as well. And so I think, you know, Richard and Phoebe hit the nail on the head. We need to move from the abstract and realize that not only do we rely on biodiversity to live, but we rely on it as an economic society to thrive. And making that tangible for us can be quite difficult.
Yeah, I think, Thomas, it'd be a good idea to bring you in here, and actually a question that we've had from the audience. And I think that it's worth looking at how farming has been affected. And, you know, someone's asked if you can explain the difference between regenerative farming and organic farming, and what role gentle farming plays in this. But we've spoken before about the effects of climate change and what it's had on your farm.
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing, because, you know, everybody needs a farmer 3 times a day, and, you know, there's this tiny bit of soil that covers the planet that supports all life on Earth, and farmers are the ones that are caring for that and feeding everybody. But the super exciting thing is soil also has this amazing potential to be part of a climate solution. So over the last 100 years or so, and, you know, really because of population growth and because of the world wars, farmers have been, or the system really has intensified and forced farmers to kind of use quite destructive practices, like quite heavy cultivation and various chemicals and things like this. And what that has meant is that our soils have been damaged and degraded. And it, you know, nobody's kind of done it on purpose. You know, we all did the best intentions. We was all trying to feed the world, but we just didn't understand that it had this consequence. And now we're starting to understand that it's had this consequence, and our soils are, you know, badly treated, and they really have lost all of their carbon. They've lost all their structure. They've lost all of their integrity. And now we have, we're really going back to our roots as farmers. We're looking at how they used to do it before we had all of these new innovations, and really going back to nature. And that's what regenerative farming is. It's farming in harmony with nature. You know, I don't use any insecticides. I do very, very minimal cultivations. I plant a big diversity of crops. And what this has meant is my soil has transformed. My soil is improved. You know, we've been doing it on our farm for about 15 years or so. And yeah, I mean, I could talk for ages about the differences and the benefits and how it's changed what we grow. But just to quickly answer the question, difference between organic and regenerative, it's obviously a question we always get. Basically, an organic system doesn't use any chemicals. We all know that. And or a regenerative system like mine, I will still use a small amount of chemicals where necessary. And the reason for this is to grow my crop, I need to control weeds in my fields and control that. And in an organic system, what they do is obviously they don't have chemicals. So what they do is they do some heavy cultivations to destroy the weeds. Absolutely fine. But what that means is every time they're cultivating, they're releasing carbon and damaging their soils. I don't want to do that. I don't want to damage my soils. I want to do minimum cultivations and no-till farming, it's called. But what that means is I just have to use a tiny little bit of herbicides just to kill the tops of the weeds. And if you look at a carbon balance for that, it's in the right it's the right thing to do. Absolutely, the holy grail is no-till and organic, but we're not quite there on a capability yet. We've got some ideas of how to do it.
Thank you. I know that there's a lot of businesses signed up here, and what people are hoping is they get carbon credits for their nature-based solutions. Oliver, can you explain a little bit about what carbon credits are and how it works?
Yeah, sure. So a carbon credit is we would think of it as a representation of a ton of carbon, either removed from the atmosphere, so that could be through a nature-based project storing carbon in the biomass of a tree or in the soil, as Thomas was explaining, or they can also be linked to preventing emissions from being released. So a forest that's protected that could be under the threat of deforestation. And there's two clear kind of markets for this. First, you've got the mandatory compliance market, which is also known as the cap and trade, where basically a cap is set on the emissions that can be produced in a sector. So it could be like a power company. And that's based on the Paris Agreement and the Kyoto Protocol. And above a cap, companies then need to purchase credits if they want to emit greenhouse gas emissions, and they can also be traded. And then the other side is the voluntary market, which is essentially opt-in, which is where we operate, which is where companies, organizations, individuals, they choose to purchase credits. They could be nature-based credits, they could be renewable credits linked to renewable energy, or they could be tech credits linked to, say, carbon removal, so direct air carbon capture storage. And the voluntary market's really driven by the desire for organizations to not only reduce their carbon footprint, but to sort of demonstrate their commitment to protecting and regenerating our planet.
Thank you. Richard, you work with a lot of organisations that are looking to reduce their carbon footprint and to work with nature-based solutions. Would you add anything to that with carbon credits? How do you measure it?
Yeah, okay. So and I agree with all the comments we just heard. What I would add is obviously there's a lot of scrutiny and skepticism in this area at present. There have been a lot of sort of studies, articles that have come out recently. So I think it's important to sort of put that in the context of, the science is clear, but obviously in the first instance, as far as possible, we need to be focusing on sort of genuine reduction opportunities, but the science is also clear that if we're going to meet the requirements of the Paris Agreement, every pathway to 1.5 degrees has an element of carbon removal sort of in it. So there's definitely a place for carbon credits for carbon removal, and I think a lot of our work is sort of, it helps companies to sort of make sure that they're obtaining using sort of high quality carbon credits. And so things to sort of focus on there is to sort of make sure that those carbon credits will be measurable, and so the emission reductions, removals are quantifiable using recognized measurement tools, that the removals are sort of are going to be permanent. There's an internationally accepted norm is that at least of 100 years permanence, or if there's a risk of reversibility, which obviously can be the case with nature-based solutions, there are appropriate safeguards in place to sort of minimize and compensate for any sort of losses there, and then also that removals, any sort of credits sort of meet the additionality test. In other words, that they are helping to contribute to additional removals that wouldn't have happened if a project hadn't happened in the first place. And then there should also be independent scrutiny and verification of those removals in line with a widely recognized standard. So clearly a place for it, but important that it meets sort of criteria such as these in order to help us sort of reach the the goals that we all need to be working towards.
Just actually to add to Richard's comments, it's a really interesting topical area at the moment, as you said, and we sort of quickly realised the range of quality that we were seeing in the voluntary carbon market, even within certain sort of standards and certification bodies. And so actually we had to develop a quality assessment sort of screening system ourselves, which basically looks across 106 different data points for carbon, biodiversity and social impact for different nature-based projects as a way of kind of filtering and making sure projects meet the minimum standards and minimum a high integrity, high quality, and unfortunately at the moment the majority of projects we screen kind of don't meet those minimum standards, which I think is probably reflected with the some of the narrative that we're seeing and articles that we're seeing at the moment. So it's nature's complex, but I think also at the same time, without a doubt, reduction is really important, but we need to be, because of the funding gap to nature and the time sensitivities, we also need in parallel to reduction to be really channeling funds towards nature protection and restoration as well.
It's a good point you make there, and I think that we should just delve a little bit deeper into the standards. As you say, it has been mentioned a lot recently. Oliver, could you share what those standards are and what they look like?
Yeah, there's what part of the problem is there's so many different standards out there, so I think that it's complex for businesses and people to kind of navigate and know who to trust. And again, this is why we've developed this assessment that kind of looks holistically across. It's not linked to a specific standard, but it looks at, to Richard's points, the key things like additionality, permanence, leakage on the carbon side, but then on the biodiversity side, things like is there been a baseline assessment? Is there biodiversity net gain within the project? And then on the social side, the important things like is the community involved in the project? Is there free and prior informed consent? And other kind of tricky topics like that. But we're actually working with the British Standards Institute on a DEFRA project, which is bringing together a few different stakeholders to try and sort of showcase best practice in the market and highlight which standards should be followed and which elements are kind of leading the conversation. So that's a kind of piece of ongoing work that we're supporting this year.
Thanks. Phoebe, what about you? Do you see different standards, and what do you see companies leading towards?
I think it is. I think it's so difficult. Even if you're looking yourself, it's so difficult to know whether you're choosing someone who is genuine, and it's looking for that. It's that longevity, isn't it? That nature-based solutions have to remain fit for purpose, and if you just end up signing up something that's like more of a tick box exercise, and there's no management for the future, there's no sort of ongoing monitoring of that sort of nature-based solution, can quickly become unfit for purpose. And I think it is really, really difficult to choose. I mean, there's some really good ones. There's a Wilder Carbon. Kent Wildlife Trust have set that up. That's a really good one that they're working on at the minute. Within my area, it's more to do with building. So the building with nature standards come in with creating the nature-based solutions, and you have to meet those standards in order to get that accreditation. And that does require ongoing monitoring and maintenance of those nature-based solutions. And I think that's what's needed. But it is very difficult to navigate, the huge array that are out there and make sure that you're choosing, the correct one.
Yeah, I think that's why so many people signed up today and have joined us. because there's that understanding and people want to understand what the right thing to do is. Do you think that all nature-based solutions are equal? Richard, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So, well, I mean, again, sort of taking that sort of, anthropocentric lens, if we're talking about the potential for impact and, for being solutions to help us tackle, the key interconnected challenges that we're facing, like climate change, then the answer's clearly no. So, really, what we want is to design nature-based solutions that help contribute to tackling these interconnected challenges that we're facing. So we've got biodiversity loss, we've got climate change, we've also got sort of issues around human rights. So we need solutions that are going to be sort of that are people centered, where there's a strong input of local communities, of local knowledge, including traditional knowledge, leveraging the knowledge of indigenous communities where that's relevant, for example. So we need nature-based solutions that are inclusive, that are developed with respect to land rights, respect to sort of the views of local communities, of local people, and then clearly we need, as far as possible, those benefits to be measurable, in line with internationally sort of recognized standards and frameworks. And there's a lot that's starting to emerge in this area, as I sort of briefly touched on previously, and they need to be sort of helping meet those helping us meet those tests that I also mentioned previously in terms of additionality and permanence. So yeah, I think that's what I would say there.
Thank you. We've had a question from the audience, and I think this is a good time to discuss it. Does the panel think it's time for regulation on offsets to stamp out greenwashing and bogus scams and introduction to severe penalties? Does anyone want to take that? Oliver?
I'm happy to. Yeah, I mean, I think, look, more regulation would be brilliant, and I know there's various groups looking at this at the moment. I'm not sure how much progress has been made given the complexities of it. I think it's not necessarily carbon credits that are the bad thing, because it's an amazing tool for protecting and regenerating nature, but they have to be used in the right way. They have to be high quality, high integrity projects. Firstly, they have to go alongside a robust multi-year reduction strategy. And I think also, we're really encouraging businesses to go above and beyond, not just focus on net zero and neutrality, but to give back more to the planet than they need to take to exist, to really kind of move the dial forward. But no, look, we would welcome more regulation to remove bad actors and to bring more quality to the market.
Elizabeth, do you have something to add to that on the regulations?
I think less on the regulation side, because obviously governments and kind of consistent structures need to provide the parameters that organizations operate within, but regulation moves slowly, and I think there needs to be a lot of accountability also put on organizations to commit to making sustainable claims that are accurate, factual, and true. And I think in the context of nature, and in particularly biodiversity, it's complex. A lot of organizations are, they're much further behind in their nature journey than they are on their climate journey. And so there's a lot of hesitancy around how to engage, but also how to articulate that engagement. But that articulation is important because we need to showcase that nature is an issue, and private institutions are a massive way to do that, not only from the impact they have across their supply chains, but their interaction with consumers and getting that engagement at a people level. And if you think of fundamentally, greenwashing is when organizations say they're acting more sustainably than they actually are. Setting fundamental principles for yourself as an organization are really valuable. So making sure you're articulating how you're supporting your claims. What evidence is this? Be clear in your language. Clarity is a form of transparency. but also like how is sustainability embedded in your organizational culture and leadership? That indicates a much longer term vision, and it kind of removes some of the skepticism and hopefully a focus on kind of a short-term halo around a project, and it's embedded. And the last thing I would say is everyone has brought up in some way, shape or form engagement with local communities, and I cannot stress that enough, how important that is, especially in the context of nature-based solutions, where these are typically stakeholder driven or region specific, and the groups with the best knowledge and how to ensure these are adding value need to have their voices brought to the table, but obviously in a humane and fair way, and in a way that's not manipulative. So if I kind of take a step back and summarize, there's two sides to the same coin when it comes to standards and greenwashing. Sorry, Richard, go ahead.
No, I agree with those points. Yeah. Did you want me to say something as well, Sam?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'll just add then that as I said earlier, there is a lot of sort of concern around potential greenwashing at present, but we are seeing in response. We have seen recently a lot of important initiatives. For example, in the UK, quite recently, there's been a greenwashing code that has been published by one of the UK regulators. There's also there are initiatives in the EU in terms of sort of fining companies that make misleading greenwashing claims. So I think this is in response to this sort of stakeholder interest and concern that we've seen around this area, and I think I think we've had this sort of, it would be like something we've seen across sustainability, is that often things can start with companies sort of and other stakeholders having an initiative, making almost like a self-declaration, but then as things sort of gain prominence, we see this sort of move towards standardization with regulation coming in. And I think we see that direction of travel in many areas, also in this area, that I think a lot of companies have been operating outside their comfort zone. They have been sort of putting reporting on new things for the first time, but an issue has been there hasn't been like a global definition consensus in terms of how to report in a lot of instances. So I think it's welcome that we're starting to see things like sort of new greenwashing codes coming out, which sort of help sort of codify the key principles as to how companies should report and what constitutes greenwashing. Because there've been some interesting studies recently that have shown it can be quite nuanced, it can take different forms, and I think this will really help drive improvement. This is quite significant, but it's currently like a work in progress. But that sort of helps set the context. If you look at the greenwashing codes, they sort of say things like companies need to not omit any sort of significant information. So if a company is going to talk about the benefits, it should also be looking against potential sort of negative impacts, those sort of negative externalities. It needs to consider the full life cycle of a product or an intervention. It needs to sort of report in a way that is unambiguous. It needs to report in a way that can be substantiated, not just making sort of groundless claims. So I think this is clearly an area that's evolving, but I think partly in light of the stakeholder concern in this area, we can see some really significant developments, and I think this is really going to help make sure that companies are reporting in an accurate way.
Thank you. Really, really good points there. Elizabeth, I wondered if you can explain, and I'd like to, I'm not sure who's joined us for the webinar currently, but I think it's important to look at carbon neutrality versus net zero. What does that mean, and where do nature-based solutions fit into that? Could you explain for the audience?
Absolutely. So I think it's important to emphasize that both carbon neutral and net zero, although they are referring to different actions, they're both essential means to combating climate change. So carbon neutrality is when a company looks at their emissions and they seek to balance or offset them by removing the equivalent amount of CO2 from the atmosphere. And so that's either, investing in planting trees or renewable energy. Whereas conversely, net zero is when a company looks at all their emissions and seeks to reduce them in line with the 1.5 degree maximum kind of warming target that was set in the context of Paris. And I think when we think about the role of nature-based solutions in our carbon journey, and people have spoken about it already, but it's really important to emphasize and highlight how nature loss and climate change are connected. They're both fundamental pillars of environmental market failure. And so, the destruction of nature is a key driver of climate change. Deforestation is reducing the Earth's ability to capture and store carbon, whereas conversely, temperature rises and extreme weather patterns are reducing the resilience of ecosystems. And so with this lens, it's very kind of clear the role that nature-based solutions can play in climate resilience and adaptation, especially in adaptation, but it is important that it's not used instead of climate strategies. It needs to be in addition to. It's not an offset. It has benefits that kind of seek to achieve the same goal, but we need to look at them separately and together. And so a really good example of that, especially in the context of our cities, is the urban environment. So, a lot of buildings are made out of concrete. They don't have a massive absorptive capacity. So especially in the face of heavy rainfall, we get kind of, flash flooding, whereas nature-based solutions that incorporate kind of green urban settings into that built environment, especially ones that have a lot more natural hydrological processes, are much more effective at kind of preventing these kind of destructive outcomes as a result of global warming and our impact on carbon.
Thank you. I think it's important to look at how we can relate that to business, but how many of the people here are going to want to present nature-based solutions to their stakeholders and to their boards. How do they make the financial case for that? Ollie, do you want to take that?
I mean, I think it's nature loss is everyone's business in a way, because when we touched on a few of these things, but like the economic and health sort of reasons, biodiversity ecosystems provide a wide range of services essential for our well-being and economic development. So like pollination is one of the ones that we talk about often. But as an element, there's an element of risk management there. Businesses that rely on natural resources, so agriculture, forestry, they're very vulnerable to the impacts of nature loss. So decline in pollinators could reduce crop yields, as an example. Deforestation could lead to increased flooding and landslides. But I think the reputation element is also really important. Businesses that are seen to be contributing to nature loss, can have serious sort of issues and reputational risks, and the public perception of them can be very negative. And consumers and investors are increasingly, they're concerned about the environmental impact of products and of businesses and the services that they use. And I think the final thing I'd probably add is on the legal and regulatory side. There's a lot of risks there, and governments are increasingly implementing laws and regulations that aim to protect biodiversity and ecosystems. Businesses that fail to comply with these regulations, may well face penalties in the future. So yeah, those are some of the kind of the reasons why I'd be taking this to the management team of a company.
What about you, Phoebe? Do you have anything to add there? How organisations can make the business financial case for nature-based solutions?
I think it is just that understanding that it is vital to every aspect of everybody's life, which includes every company, and there is that, like I said, that risk element of taking nature and biodiversity for granted. People might not think it impacts their company, but it genuinely does. It underpins all their economic activities. It underpins everything. And if we just gloss over that, there's so many risks associated with that, disruption to supply chains, it's a variety of things. And I think it's just that companies really have to start getting on board with the significance of biodiversity. But a lot of that, I think, comes from the fact that the media portrays biodiversity so poorly. It's covered so minimally compared to, say, the climate crisis, but obviously they're both so interlinked. But biodiversity gets, no sort of recognition, and until it started to be discussed more widely, I think, within the media and by everybody, people won't understand its value, I think. So so it is taking that risk element and the value and the importance of it up to your management team, as you said, and putting the case for its significant benefits to us all.
Yeah, and actually, companies that are doing good, it's good for their team and their employees, and seem to be doing good. Ollie, you had something to add?
Yeah, no, I was going to say exactly that. We see so there's a few like elements where actually it can help a business. So we have customers that are investing in nature above and beyond their company commitments to reward their customers, and they see increased engagement, they see increased sales, and as you said, like keeping retaining team members and making sure they're motivated and inspired by what the business is doing, attracting customers, retaining customers. So actually, I think we all know it's the right thing to do, but for getting like mass market mainstream companies investing in nature, I think showing this ROI piece is going to become a really important lever to really scale this up. And so again, that's something that we're really thinking about and focusing on at Earthly, and sharing those case studies where our clients have had that success.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I add to that just briefly,
do.
Sam? So great comments. I think what this is also sort of touching on is how really when we come to so much of sustainability, nature, biodiversity, basically we can see there's a need for a new paradigm, because our prevailing sort of paradigm, economic sort of model is based very much on a sort of a short-termist approach, where we consider the short-term impacts, we consider the direct financial sort of implications, returns and costs, and the focus is on certain stakeholder groups. Obviously that's all important, but when we come to sort of discussion around nature, biodiversity, it's clear that in addition to all of that, we need to look more broadly, because obviously biodiversity is all about those indirect sort of impacts, the interconnectivity of life. So we've got that direct piece, but if we're only going to think in terms of those short-term direct impacts, we're only going to be looking at a small part of a much bigger picture. And so, although what we've been focusing on up until now is all valid, really, this sort of is an example of the need for a new paradigm, where we'll consider not just those short-term impacts, but also the longer-term ones, not just those direct impacts, but also the indirect ones, not just the conventional stakeholders, but we'll consider stakeholders more broadly, and indeed we'll consider new stakeholder groups.
Great.
I don't know if we have time to build on that.
We've got lots of questions coming in, but go on.
Richard, I think, makes an excellent point. And I just there's a quote that's from the opening of the Finance Day at the UN Biodiversity COP that took place in Montreal in December, that I think really emphasizes the need for a paradigm shift that Richard is alluding to. And it's from Emmanuel Faber. And he says, environmental changes will redefine competitive advantage in the next 10 years for all companies, all investors, and all countries. So it's going to come down to really access to water, energy, soil, food, and this is what is going to reshape these advantages. And so when you look internally at the organization, it also requires a huge shift in the kind of muscle memory of how companies operate. Nature cannot just be seen as a cost line. It needs to be integrated in all decision-making that we are doing as a financial institution, as a business, because ultimately that's then what is going to change, our strategies, our asset allocation, our financial decisions. Because Richard's so right, we need to fundamentally rethink the economic value of nature. There is a financial return. So much of our economy is grounded in that, but it's not going to be a short-term and easy and immediate win.
Yeah. Good to add. We have got lots and lots of questions, and I know we've only got 15 minutes left. I'm going to try and get through some of the audience questions. Gavin has asked, how optimistic are the panel that the EU corporate sustainability reporting standards, which incorporates biodiversity and water scarcity, will move the dial for larger corporates? And do you feel that the UK should align with the EU approach? Richard, I think you work for a large corporate. It'd be interesting to hear your points on that.
I mean, I think it's it's a really significant development, and obviously, when we look more broadly, we can see a lot of important new and emerging standards and frameworks and updated standards that will be coming through in the near future. So from the EU, we've got CSRD and the EU taxonomy. We've got things like the TNFD. There's developments in many different sort of jurisdictions now. So as so often with discussions around sustainability, if we look at those things in isolation, it can be sort of quite interesting. But really, it becomes a lot more powerful when we look at that overall landscape and in terms of, what's happening when we sort of say, well, companies will be impacted by, CSRD, but they'll also then we've got TNFD and we've got these other things happening, and taken together, then it becomes a much more of a compelling narrative. So, yeah, I think it is going to be a step up for many businesses. The CSRD is going to be many more companies than the sort of previous iteration, the non-financial reporting directive, and we have these new EU standards that are coming through that will be a lot more prescriptive, although they draw heavily on sort of what has already been what's already sort of in place in many cases. So they're an important contribution, I would say. And yes, it would be good for the UK to sort of align with those, as far as possible with the CSRD. And of course, like touched, underpinning things like the CSRD is those sort of internationally accepted standards, such as, the GRI standards, SASB, TCFD, and so on.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for answering that. There's another question which is about linking nature-based solutions to the societal challenges. So do the panel feel that linking these to the societal challenges they address will enable more funding to flow nature-based solutions? Do biodiversity net gain requirements in planning change the landscape? Would anyone like to take that? Oliver?
I think it's one of the focus areas for us as the built environment, and the biodiversity net gain legislation coming into play later this year is really fascinating, and hopefully will start a trend of that being applied to other industries, and supporting the projects local to development or local to a business, makes complete sense. But also I think we're focused on mapping out projects and looking at the impact potential. And if there's a certain amount of sort of funds that can go towards a project, I also am quite excited by the idea of channeling that money where it can have most impact and not being kind of geographically kind of constrained with that. Especially as we touched on earlier, a lot of the people who are going to be most affected by climate change are in the global south, for actually helping them become more resilient, and sort of supporting them seems quite attractive as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for answering that. What does good look like? A great question from Victoria. And has anyone got any examples of companies that are doing that? Anyone want to answer that?
I can only sort of talk about it in sort of within the built environment, and it's going back to these sort of building with nature standards that, good has to represent high quality green infrastructure, green and blue infrastructure for nature-based solutions. And again, it's retaining that ability to be fit for purpose, to have that dual functionality. You are capturing carbon. Well, it's more than dual functionality. You want carbon capture, but you want it to be of value to biodiversity. There's no point in putting in a feature that will, I suppose it goes back to things like right tree, right place, doesn't it? We can all go, oh, that looks great because we planted a forest. If we planted a forest in isolation from other forests, or we've planted a forest on an otherwise rich habitat and we put things in the wrong place, or I think good has to reflect a set of standards. And I think the IUCN have just released a set of global standards, and I think that's a really important step forward. But then I think depending on which sector you're working in. I think, you know, good needs to be defined in all standards within various sectors.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thomas, oh, sorry, go on, Richard.
Yeah, no, just to sort of reiterate really the point from earlier, as we were saying in terms of good, you know, we also mentioned those sort of principles that that a project should be sort of you know, be able to contribute towards in terms of, you know, measurable benefits as far as possible, additionality, permanence of those benefits. Yeah.
Yeah, and we've spoken a lot about community and the importance of community, and I guess this is where small businesses fit in. Thomas, maybe over to you a little bit on this, especially I guess for you as a farmer, that community is very important to you. But how do you think that small businesses can do their bit, and what can they do, and how can they?
Yeah. It's been really, I haven't said much, but it's been very interesting listening to everybody and listening to all of the talk around standards and additionality and all that kind of thing. And you know, I was just sitting there kind of ticking off like, I think I'm doing all of those things. You know, obviously I'm running a project here. You know, I've got 800-hectare arable farm. Effectively, it's a project. I'm, you know, planting the trees and all that kind of thing. I think we really touched on the point when we said about it's not just one thing, right? I measure my impact in carbon because it's kind of the thing that I'm able to measure very easily, and it's quite simple. But, you know, the food that I produce my soil is better, so the food comes more nutritious out of it. My water quality, I don't have any water issues, you know, compared to all the fields around my farm. Biodiversity, you know, you can walk through my farm and, you know, there's a huge amount more birds and life than anywhere around here. So like, I guess I'm a little bit biased, but this is why supporting farmers within your local area is super exciting, because there's also that accountability phase of like, you know, I want people that are supporting my way of farming to try past my farm, and if they see something they don't like, text me and I'll tell them what the reason of that was, you know, the reason why that happened. I think I'm really excited to get more local businesses involved and more interest, and obviously I work with farmers all over the country that are doing the same thing. So yeah, I hope businesses want to talk to more farmers.
Right. Ollie, do you have anything to add for small businesses and working with the local community? What can they do? You're on mute.
Yeah, no, I think, yeah, it's great for, you know, we have a lot of customers that want to support local projects. They can actually go and they can take their teams and take their customers to see and visit and kind of connect. And, you know, going back to the point that we've been talking about, there is this kind of disconnect between nature, and so it's hard for us to understand it, and it feels more abstract because we're not experiencing it so much. So again, I think that's really valuable and really powerful to have local projects you can support and sort of see and touch and experience.
Yeah. And what about for some of the projects that you're working with at the moment? What are you starting to see, and what kind of things are coming out of those projects? Be interesting to hear.
Yeah, I mean, the two sides are, you know, as I mentioned, we have this scoring sort of assessment that looks at, you know, it's really holistic, and we have kind of minimum standards within each of those areas. So what it does is it enables, it kind of de-risks the investments into projects because, you know, they're meeting minimum standards, but also at the same time you can kind of see the features and the unique aspects of different nature-based projects. So as a business, you can find projects that align with your values. So it might be female empowerment, or it might be a biodiversity net gain focus, sort of depending on what you're doing. So that's an interesting sort of trend to see. But on the other side, we're seeing you know, more businesses going beyond net zero, wanting to have a net positive impact, give back more to the planet than they need to take to exist.
Yeah.
And I think that is really exciting, because if we have a future where, you know, the thriving companies are competing not just on quality and price, but on the kind of the good that they're giving back to the planet, I think that's the paradigm sort of shift and change that we need. And so we're excited to be kind of helping businesses achieve that.
Yeah.
Everyone's nodding along to that.
Yeah. Can I comment really quickly on that, Sam?
Yeah,
I'm conscious of time. Yeah. I think that's right. In terms of the connecting to sort of the paradigm change, but also how, and we've touched on sort of, the narrative around, around sort of nature sustainability. I think often there has been sort of like a problem with the narrative around sustainability. I feel that often it's been sort of overwhelmingly negative, sort of focusing on, and as a result, it's often seemed a bit defeatist, and I feel it's probably meant that a lot of people have been sort of put off from engaging with these issues. And I think what we're starting to see is some sort of initiatives and companies looking to be more ambitious and to go to sort of setting goals around nature positive. And yes, there are issues around what does that mean, and reaching global definition. As we said, so often with sustainability, there's this sort of work in progress, but nevertheless, that's increasingly the ambition. And I think we see that in other areas like climate positive and so on. And I think that's really exciting because given the scale of the challenges, we do need to be sort of pushing and being as ambitious and sort of challenging ourselves to go further and faster wherever we can. And so in the early days, a lot of the focus was on sort of reducing our impacts and doing a bit less bad and reducing emissions and so on. And obviously, okay, great. But if I were to give a financial analogy, that would be sort of like a company reducing its costs. Okay, good, but let's go beyond that. And now a lot of the talk is around being sort of net zero. That's also obviously a step up, but it would be like a break-even financial analogy. Now we're starting to see sort of things going beyond that to being sort of nature positive, climate positive, questions over definitions, but really that's sort of then going into the area of, well, being a profitable business. And given the scale of the challenges, it's not just about doing a bit less bad. It's about sort of how do we also look to sort of start to focus on restoration and turning things around.
Great, thank you so much. We have 3 minutes left, and I just want to go around all of the panelists and just say, have you got any final words, tips for, we still have an amazing number of participants here. What would be your final words? Phoebe, let's start with you.
So nature-based solutions, it's doing what nature has always done, isn't it? I mean, it sounds like we've reinvented the wheel, but it's not. I mean, if we've just undone everything and now we're trying to restore it and put it back together. But yeah, for me, it has to be, everything has to be in the right place. It has to be connectivity. There's no point in putting in these nature-based solutions if there's no sort of connection to other habitats, creating sort of this wider landscape scale approach. Really, and they've got to remain functional, and biodiversity has to be a major part of that, and they have to be protected ongoing into the future.
Thank you. Elizabeth, final words from you?
Mine will be a bit more macro, but I think it's really important to emphasize that the value of nature is often only felt once it's lost. And someone once said this beautifully, there's no bill from the bees. So nature is not going to invoice us for the damage that we have caused it. And so we must account for it, and we must be doing everything we can to help recover and help restore. And nature-based solutions is one of those levers that we have at our disposal that, as Phoebe said, nature has given us to use to help. So just keeping that in mind.
Really lovely. Thanks. Thomas, do you want to say final?
Yeah, absolutely. The thing I was really say is just champion farmers, really. Farmers are the people that are looking after all of the nature around all of your houses and all of your cities. So if you ever get a chance to speak to somebody, go and speak to a farmer. Hopefully they're not too grumpy. Ask them what they're doing, ask them how their farm's looking, and just connect more with where your food comes from.
Richard, do you have any final comments?
I think I gave mine just then, to be honest.
Yeah. Ollie, let's finish with you.
No, I'd just like to expand, on the, I think what's super exciting is we're living through this amazing kind of economic transformation from an economy that takes from our planet to one that gives back. And, I firmly believe the thriving companies of the future will be those that have the environment at their hearts and are giving a net positive impacts back to the planet. And I'm just really excited at Earthly to be kind of helping these regenerative companies of tomorrow connect to the most impactful nature-based projects around the world and integrate nature into their business to protect and restore our planet. So thank you for having me.
Thank you everyone for joining us. It's really been a great session. I know there's still loads of questions. I am going to copy those and we'll come back to everyone, and also the comments there as well. We'll make sure that we share everything that's asked for, and we will get a recording of this webinar out. And if anyone has any further questions, then please do connect with any of us on LinkedIn. I'll send everyone's links in the follow-up, but you can connect with me there. And if anyone else wants to share their LinkedIn, it's been brilliant. Really enjoyed it. Thank you everyone so much. Thank you to Earthly, our partner. It's been such a great and insightful webinar. Have a good day.
Okay, thanks everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye-bye.